I can't obviously deal with the entire war of the period tonight, because if you did, we'd be here till tomorrow morning. So really what I'm going to be talking about tonight is about what I've said is the birth of modern combined operations. And I'll explain why I say that as we go along. So let's get into this. A couple of other little positive things for you, though, hopefully. Right, one thing I can supply you tonight is lots of blue sky and blue water, which will hopefully make you feel a little bit more relaxed in the present situation we have at the present time. So you can at least dream of places you could be rather than actually being there for now. But anyway, now, obviously, ships have transported soldiers places forever. The Romans did it, the Greeks did it, the Phoenicians did it, the Vikings did it. So clearly, combined operations, if you want to call it that, has never been far away from the naval operation, should we say. But clearly, that is not really what I'm talking about. And what I will look at is more the actual operation of a navy actually dropping an army onto a shore which is defended. And that is actually what I'm talking about regarding proper combined operations against a defended shore, which obviously in a lot of these cases previously to that wasn't the case. Now, if we look at the actual Napoleonic Wars in total, and look at places where the British had quite an influence or something major happened during the period, you can see it literally throughout the entire Mediterranean, something happened quite major. So, you know, they were involved in every single aspect of that part of the world. And one of the things I want to bring is obviously, as I've literally hinted before, the Navy and the Army have always been very different services. When I was a naval person, we had specific names for the Army, also for the RAF actually. I won't say them now because they're not particularly friendly. And I'm sure the Army has got similar statements about the Navy. The Navy at this period are quite often seen as gung-ho, just going for it, and you know, devil may care, should we say. And the Army are often portrayed as being sort of the army of Wellington's forces, where it's literally a case of everything is done to a very slow, methodical, organized pace, very highly disciplined, etc. Very different, and often irritates the other dramatically. I have to say, having been in the Navy, the Army still manages to irritate the Navy even today. Now, when we start looking at the actual number of units supplied by Britain to this theatre, if you look at the chart here now, the first thing is the red are Army battalions. And as you can see, in 1793, there were very few in the Mediterranean, but there are two major peaks, which actually happened on 1801 and 1807. And I'm sure most of you will actually realize that that's the two campaigns in Egypt, when we had more troops in the Mediterranean than any other time, even when we were actually in eastern Spain. But if you look over the entire graph, if you look at the whole period from 1793, ignoring those gaps, these peaks, you can actually see that there is more than a trebling of the number of battalions towards the end of the war. So in fact, for the Army, it became a much bigger operation as we went on. With regard to the Navy, I've looked at these are the number of line of battle warships, and warships generally, and basically you can see that in the start of the war there's around about 30 odd in the Mediterranean. It drops down dramatically towards 1803, down to under 20, because this is the period where we actually get into the biggest threat as far as Britain is concerned for an invasion, and more and more ships are being taken back towards that part of the world. And then, as you can see later on, there's even a doubling of the naval contingent in the Mediterranean later on. So as you can see, for both sides, it becomes a major area of operation. Now, I want to go back to landings elsewhere. And 1793, as we know, Arthur Wellesley, as he was later to become the Duke of Wellington, said, "I learned what ought not to be done here." We can also say that of many other officers, and we'll come across officers who were involved in landings later on. And in fact, the landings in Holland were not disastrous, but they were not the best coordinated. They were actually quite poorly organized. And as I said, people who were here, like Abercrombie, later General Abercrombie, actually learned from this that there were better ways of doing things. But let's look at just a general operation in the early parts of the war. So we'll look at the landing on Martinique in 1794. Now, if you look at the general map of Martinique, the main French force was at Fort de France. But if you look at where the Royal Navy deposit the British soldiers, they deliver them at 3 points many miles away from that location. Now, this one here, Gros Morne, etc., was done because of the fact it was on the lee side of the island, so that the winds weren't a problem. But as you can see, the other two were miles and miles away from there. And when these forces had to then march across, you have to bear in mind, virtually jungle countryside, plus large mountain ranges, they had a huge problem in actually maneuvering their infantry and artillery through to actually attack Fort de France. And the whole point is that the Navy, to be perfectly honest, always sees soldiers on board their ships as a complete and utter nuisance. And they will get them off the ship at the first and easiest opportunity. And at this time, it is not the generals who are deciding where they're going to be landed. It is the naval officers commanding who are actually just finding the best location for them to drop them off. And there is very little consideration to what the then infantry are then going to have to face in that place. Because certainly there was absolutely no reason why some units could not be dropped off in this bay much, much closer to the location they wanted to get to. But that was typical of most operations in the early parts of the war and for many years before. The Navy dropping them off at what was most useful for them, or the easiest for them. Now, when we start talking about the war in the Mediterranean, we have to look at it as different sections. And the first one I've sort of brought forward is actually saying that the war starts as a war of opportunities, because the Navy in the Mediterranean, as you can see, they didn't have a large numbers of troops, but they're waiting for opportunities to happen. And of course, the first one that really happens right at the start is that Toulon, the major naval base for the Mediterranean fleet, it's a huge base, but as you can see, surrounded by these huge mountains, decides that it wants to remain loyal to the royalists. And therefore, the Republican armies are threatening both Marseille and Toulon. They go to Marseille first and start literally destroying Marseille, literally razing it to the ground. And Toulon sees what's coming their way and calls for help. So they call for help, and luckily at the time, Admiral Hood is in the area and is able to get some troops together and actually brings them in. They're invited into Toulon. One of the things that happens is that obviously the British arrive, but they also have other people that come and actually give them support. We have the Neapolitan troops. We have troops that come from all the sort of small Italian states along the top of the coast there. We even have troops that come from, or are due to come from, Malta, which strangely enough is actually meant to be, completely sort of neutral in everything that goes on at this time. But Malta actually agrees to supply 1,500 mercenaries. They're due to arrive as well. But this conglomeration of troops, including Spanish troops as well, plus you've got Spanish Navy turns up as well, tries to defend Toulon. And obviously we can't go into this in great detail now, but what we end up with is about 17,000 troops, Allied troops, trying to hold somewhere where the French eventually bring 45,000 men against it. And they're actually trying to cover about 5 kilometers of actual defenses, which is just way beyond what they can actually control. Admiral Hood has a terrible relationship with both Lord Mulgrave, who actually starts being the officer in charge of the infantry there, later General O'Hara, and then when he gets wounded, General Dundas takes over. All names we're probably well aware of. But all of them have a terrible fight with Admiral Hood constantly. Admiral Hood wants to be in charge. He believes he's the most senior man there, and therefore wants to organize things, even in the actual infantry defenses and everything else. They clearly say he hasn't got the rules of engagement to do that. He hasn't been given permission to do that by government, and he constantly has that fight. So there is this constant fight with everybody. Obviously, I'm not going to go into the full story of this now, but we know that we end up with a young artillery officer called Napoleon Bonaparte getting involved in actually capturing these heights here, the heights of de la Grasse, which actually gives them control over their artillery there from the forts, can actually drive ships out of both the inner and the outer harbours here. That's what's happened, and there is it ends up with the fleet having to hurriedly leave. However, Sir Sidney Smith and Admiral Langara from Spain are given the job of destroying the French fleet which is in there. Now, there are, as I said, you can see on the right here, there are 31 ships of the line in Toulon at this time, but because there is a mess up in the destruction of them, only 9 are burnt and 4 are taken away as prizes. And of the 27 smaller ships that were there, only 5 are burnt and 15 are taken away as prizes. Now, my big criticism of this is that Hood knew that realistically, they were never going to be able to hold Toulon forever. There was no way they had the troops to hold it against what the French could bring against them. And he had the opportunity of moving many of these ships out before the crisis and taking them to places like Gibraltar. He could have actually negated the entire Toulon fleet. He didn't. And they left, leaving 18 sail of the line and 7 smaller ships in the harbour. And that actually causes them huge problems in the future. So it is an opportunity they had, which they actually squandered. Now, the next opportunity came along quite quickly afterwards. Corsica had only been French since 1768. That's the year before Napoleon was born, which actually then made him French. And Paoli, who Napoleon had originally been quite close to, had turned against the French domination of Corsica and was looking to actually get rid of them. And they're starting a guerrilla war and invited Hood and the Brits again to help them. Now, again, with regard to the Navy turning up, they dropped them on the coast over here, on this side of the island. The biggest problem with that was that, again, left them with huge mountain ranges they had to march across to get to the 3 main fortresses on the island, which they would have to take to get the French out. And not only that, but Hood falls out again with Dundas, and then with Charles Stuart, who actually takes over from him, again insisting that he wants to be in control of everything and cannot expect to be allowed the infantry to do their own thing, basically. Clearly, they're not happy with that, and it leads to constant fights. It ends up with the admiral refusing to actually have his marines ashore. It ends up with the infantry effectively saying we can't go ahead and attack Bastia first of all because we haven't got enough troops, and it ends up with the admiral effectively taking the navy up to Bastia to actually carry on the siege almost without the army, doing it themselves. And as you can see on the side there, I've put a quote in there that Horatio Nelson gives at this time, is the fact that they hate us sailors because we're too active for them and we accomplish our business sooner than they like. The army were waiting until they had reinforcements. They didn't think they had enough troops before to do it. And it started the whole thing off. Now, one of the things, there's a couple of things about this island that are important or to our history in a sense. But the first is that we end up with the Martello Towers. Mortella Tower, the one Mortella Tower on Point Martella is actually in here. When the fleet first arrived, it caused them huge problems, and a number of ships got badly damaged. However, as soon as they managed to land some guns ashore and attack it from the landward side, it actually quite quickly surrendered. However, the design was liked. The Navy realized how damaging it had been for them for an attacking fleet trying to land troops. And that's why the Martello Towers that we then built later on came from this design, this general design. But a couple of other things is when they got to Bastia, the Navy, for example, are told by people like Sir John Moore, who is actually second to Dundas, that you're going to have to wait for more troops. We need to be able to actually besiege this place properly. The Navy say, no, we can do it. And Dundas gets them to set it up. And he set up their siege guns in their sort of forward trenches, etc., only to find that the guns are way too far away from the fortress to actually make any difference. And eventually the Admiral agrees that they're going to have to just starve them out. And that's what they do. Because they realized that they really didn't know what they were doing in regard to siege warfare. Of course, after that, they went to Calvi and take Calvi, and that's obviously famous for the fact that Nelson gets involved there and actually has damage to his eye, which means that he's virtually blind in one eye for the rest of his life. Although he can see light and dark, that's it. It's also famous for one other thing, when one poor Lieutenant Byron actually gets killed. And the effect of that is that he was actually the heir to the estate of Lord Byron. So, of course, when he didn't get it, it went to a nephew of his, who then became the Lord Byron we know, who is the poet and everything else you want to call him, Greek patriot, whatever. All of that comes from this as well. Now, the Navy has had Corsica for a couple of years, but it's actually forced out again quite quickly by the French. They actually managed to sort of drive them out within a year or so. So by 1797, the Navy, apart from Gibraltar, hasn't got a real base. The only other place they're using is Leghorn and sort of Genoa on the Italian coast. And the problem with that is, of course, in 1798, you've got Napoleon invades into Italy and sort of takes over these states quite rapidly. And these bases suddenly become unavailable as well. So the Navy by 1798 is now desperate for a base, apart from Gibraltar, to keep an eye on the Toulon fleet. Now, I'm jumping ahead slightly because obviously we end up with the situation where Napoleon captures Malta in 1798 on his way to Egypt. But clearly then that turns into a siege for, as you can see, 2 years following that, with the British trying to help the local insurgents on the island to actually recapture Malta from them. And this actually forms eventually the main base for the British fleet in the Mediterranean for the next couple of 100 years. And its real significance is the fact that it's Malta, if you think about where it is halfway between Africa and the toe of Italy, really controls access to the eastern side of the Mediterranean. And once that is in British hands, and with Gibraltar on the west edge of the Mediterranean, they are restricting the French ability to do much outside of those areas. They're held within that area. But in between that, they'd also picked up Minorca. Now, the Spaniards had been with us in Toulon, But by 1796, they'd actually signed a treaty of San Ildefonso with France, and were now on the French side, which meant that the British were even under more pressure, because not only did they have the 18 odd French ships which were still in Toulon. In fact, that had been increased by some ships that had come from Brest to over 20. But it now had the entire Spanish fleet, which included Cartagena, which had about 20 odd ships in as well. So it was quite possible for the enemy to actually bring together over 40 line of battleships, and the British only had low 20s. So it was obviously a time of very great difficulty for them. But again, because they didn't have Malta until 1800, they were looking around for bases. But because obviously the Spaniards had actually now turned against Britain, they could land troops, which they did on Minorca, and take Port Mahon as their base for that period, which was obviously important for them to be able to keep an eye on what was going on in the area. One of the things you'll actually notice is that Major Slessor was there with the 35th, and the 35th spent virtually the entire war in the Mediterranean. You will come across them again and again in the future. One of the things that perhaps people don't know so much about is that, in fact, looking around for bases as well, there was also a rebellion on Elba. And the Brits managed to drop some troops in to help them hold on to Port Ferraio. But the French did land on the islands because they're not that far from the mainland, and they were able to get troops on board. And in fact, they recaptured most of the island. But in fact, Porto Ferraio was actually kept by the Brits and their allies right through until the Peace of Amiens, when it was actually returned. Now, talking about Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, obviously that happened in 1798, so we know all about that, so I'm not going to go into that in great detail now. And obviously, Nelson eventually turns up there a second time and actually finds the French fleet there and destroys it, which obviously gives him quite a bit of an advantage in this area. But what that does is allow the British to consider having to actually get the French out of Egypt. The first thing you have to bear in mind is it's nearly 2.5 years before the British actually managed to get an expedition available with enough troops and enough ships to actually be able to arrive on the actual Egyptian coast and to do anything about it. It's quite an exceptionally long time. That is another indicator of having to get troops into the Mediterranean to do this work. Now, when we get to Aboukir Bay, of course, the army is commanded by Sir Ralph Abercrombie, who, as I said, had been with Wellesley in Holland in 1793 and had also been in the West Indies, seeing a number of these landings. And he really wanted to actually reorganize it completely and make sure that landings were a lot more professional, particularly as they were highly likely to have to land against a defended shoreline. Now, he was helped in this by having Sir John Moore acting as his deputy, and Admiral Lord Keith, who, unlike his predecessors in this area, was a lot more helpful, should we say, to the army and actually tried to work with them. And the first thing that happened is that when the fleet arrived at Marmaris Bay on the Turkish coast, they actually started practicing the maneuvers of getting the troops to actually get into the boats, and to actually then for the boats to actually set off together in a wave, etc. This was constantly practiced, so the soldiers started to get an idea of what they did, where exactly they sat, and everything else. And in fact, when we get to the landing at Aboukir Bay in 1801, when you look at this is quite a good drawing of the actual operation as such and how it explains it, because in fact any organizer of D-Day would have actually recognized virtually every aspect of what was done here, and perhaps I can show a little bit of it here. The first thing is Lord Keith's fleet. They're too deep draft to actually get in close to the shore, So the transports are given all of the troops out of Admiral Keith's fleet, and they are able to come in closer because they're actually shallower draft. So the boats don't have so far to go to the beach. Inside of that, you have a line of bomb vessels, etc., who actually fire onto the French lines, which are on the crest of the ridge at the top of the beach. The actual boats themselves, they're organized to go in 3 waves. Each wave is organized that the first wave will go in a single line and all hit the beach together. And they were organized with their own signals, as you can see, flags, etc., showing the signals. They had gunboats with them to give them close fire support on the beach. And as they arrived on the beach, they were literally ordered to get out and organized to get out immediately, to make it formations, and not to hang about on the beach, but then to get up the beach as fast as possible and off the beach. Not only that, you've got naval officers who are not only involved in the actual signals out at sea and making sure all of this works. You've even got them on the beaches acting as beach commanders, arranging things to make sure that things move off. Other boats have been organized so that they've got a drop down bow so that you can actually roll a cannon off onto the beach. All of this is sounding not that dissimilar to what we saw in 1944. And it's the same sort of thing. The boats, the first wave, they would turn around, go back to the transports, pick up another wave and come in. And it was exceptionally well organized. It worked very successfully. They were lucky in the sense that the actual French force on the beach was not as strong as it could have been, but everything about it worked like clockwork. And this particular incident is, my belief, is the real start of what I would say true combined operations, when everything is brought together to ensure that they can get ashore safely and successfully on a defended shore. That's just a close-up of it. I think that's meant to be Sir Sidney Smith in the bow there. He probably wants to get himself in the front of all these pictures. The heights were not as steep as that, shall we say. Bit of dramatic license there. Now, the whole situation in the Mediterranean stays relatively placid after that. Yes, there's other things go on elsewhere, like Trafalgar, etc. But you have to bear in mind that the Toulon fleet were largely kept under control, that although the French now have the great majority of the lands around the Adriatic, because they've already taken Italy, or most of Italy, and they have, in 1805, they've been given the Dalmatian coast as well. The Russians have actually been holding the islands just off Greece, which allow them to actually maintain control of basically the entrance and out of the actual Adriatic. So the Ionian Islands at the bottom of the 7 islands there, which the Russians held, and they had a major fleet there under Admiral Semyonov, and he and they basically ensured that the few French ships that were in that area, etc., didn't cause any problems to the Navy. And the other thing they were there for is to ensure that France didn't encroach on Greece, which was, of course, part of the Ottoman Empire, because clearly the Ottoman Empire was close to falling over at this stage. And there was a great worry that Napoleon would actually take over the entire empire as well. So they were there to help us with that. But unfortunately, in 1807, of course, we have the problem of the fact that the Treaty of Tilsit, after the Russian defeats, means that no longer are the Russians there to actually do that. That fleet actually sails out of the Mediterranean and actually goes to to Lisbon, which is obviously then held by Junot and the French troops before we land there. And that's the Russian fleet that ends up being stuck in there when the Brits arrive there. But this causes a new problem for the Brits, because suddenly the Adriatic is somewhere they have to look after. Now, if we look at the Adriatic in general, we have the Ionian Islands down here. which is from Corfu down. There are actually 7 islands that altogether involved in that. We have the Dalmatian Islands up here. And obviously we have Ancona and Venice were the 2 main bases for the French fleets. Not that they had big fleets here, they had frigates and nothing more than that. There were no liner battleships in here until later when they built some at Venice. But there is something very strange about how things change here. And I think this is possibly coming from the background of how the Army and the Navy have started working more as a team rather than as 2 individuals who are trying to desperately get rid of the other as fast as possible. Because when we get into the whole Adriatic period, there is a complete change in the emphasis. It's no longer the Navy just controlling things. And I'll explain that as we go now. If most of us look at the Adriatic and have any read anything about it, it's mostly about cutting out operations, it's catching small boats in little harbours and destroying signal points and sort of, whatever else like that, and sort of gun batteries or whatever. And this is an excellent sort of diorama of somebody's sort of that sort of idea. And it's true, because to be honest, one of the things that happened out in the Adriatic was that anybody that was sent out there had the opportunity to make an absolute fortune in prize money, because it was very lucrative part of the world to actually serve in at that time. And some of the major characters you need to know about in this is obviously we've got Captain William Hoste, first of all commanding the Amphion and then later the Bacchante, who is quite famous for serving in these areas. I will mention Captain Richard Church, who is actually of the Greek Light Infantry in a very dashing uniform. I'm sure there's 1 or 2 of you would love to have had a uniform like that when you were in the army. And then, of course, we've got the 35th Foot, commanded by Colonel John Oswald and Lieutenant Colonel George Robertson. There were 2 of them, one after the other. So give you an idea of the general look of them. Now, we start off with the Ionian Islands in 1809, because clearly the Brits have taken a bit of time to actually get things started. And the first thing that happens is that they look at the Ionian Islands, because, of course, to go into the main Adriatic is going to be an even bigger task. So the first thing is to do something here. And the first thing that happens is the Navy wants a base. The nearest base they have at the moment is Malta, which is hundreds of miles away, which means if a ship has to go back for water and food, etc., they're off station for weeks, if not months. So the first priority is that. And Zante is the first one they take, now known as Zakynthos. And funny enough, it's Sir Hudson Lowe and his Corsican troops that are involved in this. They land and quickly take over and get the naval base the Navy wants. So that's it. As far as they're concerned, the Navy are not interested in the rest of the Ionian Islands. Why should we worry about them? We've got our base. We can get on and we can actually attack the sort of merchant trade in the area and sort of control everything in that sense. But things change here, and they change in a few different ways that are a bit of unexpected. Because the army, who are on Zante here, start saying, hang on a minute, what about these other islands? We can take these. We've done a bit of sort of research on looking into an intelligence on finding out what the troops are there. We think that if the Navy takes us over there, we can actually capture them. Well, the Navy are not overly keen about this. They just want the soldiers there to actually protect their base. So as far as they're concerned, why should they do it? But in fact, it happens. And in fact, the next attack is on Kefalonia, which is actually Lieutenant Colonel Robertson actually orders it, in fact, and just basically tells the Navy to give us a ship to get us over there. So that's what they do. Now, that happens. Captain Church, with his wonderful Greek uniform, takes Ithaca, and Major Clark takes Sirigo, one of the other islands. So they're expanding their operations quite dramatically. These operations, I have to say, have not been particularly hard fought. The few troops that are there are not particularly, they're not French, they're actually sort of locals who have actually been brought into service. and they're not particularly keen on actually getting involved in a fight, so they get taken over quite easily. But then we then get to Santa Maura, or Lefkada as is known today. Now this is the fortress which made this a much, much bigger undertaking than the previous ones. And again, it's the army that insists they want to take it. Navy are not interested. So what happens is the troops arrive on the island and they take the main city, which is Amaksici. It's now Lefkada, if you're actually looking on a map anytime. But the fortress, as you can see, is at the end of a very long sort of edge of a lagoon. You have to go all the way around there to get to the fort, because this is about a couple of foot or so of water all the time. The French have got a redoubt here, a big entrenchment going right across, and another redoubt before you even get to the castle. So Colonel Oswald actually orders his troops on this long march around to attack it. Now, the first thing that happens is he orders one of his commanders to keep 2 battalions here as a reserve and to keep an eye on their rear, so to make sure nobody comes in and sort of captures them in this area here. While they're doing that, and while Oswald's sorting it out and coming round, Lieutenant Church doesn't wait, no orders at all. He takes redoubt number 1. He actually just charges it, and they're so unexpected, unexpected the charge, he literally takes it. However, he comes up against the entrenchments and finds that he can't get any further. At this stage, the army tried to make an attack. They tried to bring a ship in to actually attack here as well, but in fact the entrenchments have also been put back on an angle, so they actually have got cannon that fire out to sea, so they drive the ship off. So they're a bit stuck as to what they're going to do. The officer in command here sees the issue and sees that there is an aqueduct running across before it turns into the fort to supply the water. Now, aqueducts in a lot of these places, if you've ever seen them, can actually have a paving stones across the top of them, so it actually forms like a bridge. And he literally, without orders his troops to run down the aqueduct, and they turn up in the back of the redoubt and the entrenchment, and suddenly the French realize what's going to happen, and they all rush back into the fortress. Now, there is a small siege before they actually get the fortress. It takes time, but they actually achieve it, and this is a major success. Who is this officer who broke rules and actually saved the day by his sudden reaction to what was going on? A certain Sir Hudson Lowe was the commander, and I would say it's one of the things that show up in this quite often is Hudson Lowe is shown in a very different light to the character he has portrayed as the man at St. Helena. Now, having got the Ionian Islands, apart from Corfu, Corfu has got a huge fortress on it. French have got their main army on there. And in fact, there's no way the Brits can take it. So in fact, they just ignore it. They put a naval blockade around it and they just sail on because it's beyond their ability to take at this stage. So the rest of the Ionian Islands are now British. So the British now want to push further into the Adriatic. And the first thing they have to look for, again, is a naval base. Because, even going in halfway up the Adriatic is still a long distance from their bases down there. So they start looking around, and the Navy picks up on the little island of Lissa, which is actually just off the page, if I remember. You can't actually see it. It's just over here somewhere. It's further out into the actual, out into the sea. It actually means that it's very difficult for the French and their allies, who can keep little groups of men on each of these islands, to keep men out there, because of course they're having to supply them then by ships. These ones they can do quite easily because they're very small little passages they can nip across. Out here, Lissa is a much more difficult task for them to do that. So it's a great place for the Brits, if they want to set up a base, because they know the French can't do much about it. Now, this is Lissa Naval Base, or Vis, as it's now called. As you can see, it's a good little harbour, very nice little place to actually be able to set up from. The Navy starts using it ad hoc. They don't make it fortified. They don't really have any garrison on there. They have a small number of troops. They just use it as very much a base, and a few privateers use it as well. And while the actual ships like Host are out trying to capture more merchant ships as normal, etc., along the coast, Napoleon hears of Lissa being taken and orders Admiral Dubadoux to actually make a surprise attack on the island. He does this. He arrives with a little squadron of about 5 frigates. They land. They destroy loads of stuff, and they sort of obviously capture the ships there. Now, they say that they often say about lie like a bulletin, French bulletin that is, and as you can see, it was stated the 43 ships were burned and another 34 captured. The evidence is, and then I should say the Viceroy Eugene actually put the numbers up even further and said 68 were taken in his report to Napoleon. Actual figures are 3 burned, 3 captured. Slightly different situation. And these were all privateers that got captured, or small merchant ships. But clearly the Navy were not happy with the fact that their base had been attacked. Dubadoux sort of didn't hang around very long. He saw some sail on the horizon, feared it was Host and some of the other British ships coming back, and immediately made his way back to Ancona with the treasures he'd taken off the merchant ships. However, in a second attack, Dubadoux actually came back because he had been ordered again by Napoleon to attack, and this time to take the island and hold it forever, basically. So he brings all his frigates across again. He attacks, but this time we don't know how, because Host doesn't ever say how he knew, but he must have had an inkling they were coming, because he was waiting off the island for them to arrive. And there then becomes a frigate battle. It's the biggest battle of 1811, but it's only frigates, about 4 frigates on the British side. There's about 6 frigates and a couple of other little vessels on the French side. But in fact, the Brits come out on top, capture a couple, and actually one of the actual vessels runs aground, and therefore Dubadoux leaves, and the islands are saved. And then from that stage on, the Navy gets engineers in, etc., and starts constructing fortifications on the island to ensure that it can be kept for future use, so that they have a secure base going forward. Now, we then get into the other islands again, because of course the Navy's not interested in them. It's got its base. It can go off and capture merchant ships and do all the rest of the things it wants to do, but the army wants to take the islands. So we start off with Lieutenant Colonel Robertson arranging that he wants to attack the first island across from there, which is Lagosta, or Lastova as it's now called, and they land on the island, take it quite easily. There's not a large force there on there, and he leaves Ensign John Hildebrand of the 35th Foot in charge of the island. He suddenly becomes governor, and he has about 50 odd troops he keeps with him, and he leaves the island. And one of the things I've done is actually I've published his memoir, which is a fascinating memoir. I don't normally sort of go on about my books, but if you ever want just a great boy's own adventure story, but it's true, read Ensign Hildebrand's story. He will come into it again a couple of times. But he suddenly finds him governor, and the rest of the 35th moved on. Because Robertson's not happy with just taking this island. Within time now, he actually gets to Cozola, which is just across from it. They arrive, and as you can see, the main town, although it's fortified, is right on the beach edge. So the Navy literally sort of, when the French and their allies refuse to actually surrender, they literally say, well, if you don't surrender within the hour, basically we will actually bombard you, and they then surrender immediately. So the island falls again relatively easily. There's another one that they attack later on, and Captain William Hoste this time decides that they will take another island, Lucina, or it agrees with the army, and they make an attack on Lucina, or Havar as it is today, later on in the year. And as you can see, there's a castle on the hill. Now, what the Brits didn't know when they arrived is they didn't do much in the way of sort of research for it. They literally just attacked and thought, well, we will just get it. It'll be simple. The troops stayed overnight in the castle. And it was Hoste and the naval contingent that decided it was going to be their job to get up the cliffs and to assault the castle. At the same time, the 35th Foot were ordered to take the town here. And lo and behold, when they took the town, they actually captured virtually every single officer on the island. All the French officers were actually not at the castle. They were in the comfort of buildings down here, having their breakfast when they actually made the dawn attack. Only one officer, an engineer, escaped and managed to get up to the actual castle. But when the naval crew got up there, they actually got fought off and actually took some losses. Just a few sailors running up with a couple of swords and a few muskets is not going to take a castle. And they failed completely. And in fact, Hoste sailed away in complete disgruntlement and actually really sort of abandoned the whole idea. The engineer officer wanted to keep fighting. His troops basically turned on him, and 2 days later they said, basically, you either surrender or we'll just throw you over the side of the walls and cut your throat. He then decided to surrender, and the 35th took the island. Now they moved on to other places like Split along the coast and attacked Split. Here they actually met Austrian forces now coming down in 1814 to actually capture Dalmatia for themselves again. And they came here and they actually started helping them by supplying them with guns. And in fact, as they didn't have any siege guns with them, they actually even gave them the sailors to actually man the guns as well. But the main one I want to talk about in this area is Dubrovnik, or as known as Ragusa in those days. Hoste went there first of all and said that it was impossible to attack. He couldn't do anything about it. It was too big and too beyond his abilities. But he was aware that the local population were not happy with French rule and had risen under a chap called Count Kaboga. Now, Count Kaboga said to Hoste, we have now managed to get the garrison to be besieged within the city. They have no ability to get out. They can't get food, they can't get water. They just got what they've got in the city. We need your help. Hoste felt it was beyond him, but he did actually bring some help, and he actually went to the 35th and actually spoke to Ensign Hildebrand and actually brought some of his troops over to work with them. And again, his story in working with the insurgents is actually quite an interesting story in itself. But Hoste goes off elsewhere to see what he can do. And he goes to Cattaro, or Kotor as it is known now. He went there twice, Hoste, seeing that it was a very well defended city. It had high walls, very thick walls. Apparently the walls were up to 70 feet thick. So he was well aware that even his naval guns were going to make not much on that sort of subject. However, he decided that there was one way of capturing it, and this is the famous incident where he actually brought his guns, the Navy got their guns up this high land. As you can see, the photograph is being taken down onto the city. they got the guns up onto the crests here and fired into the city from down here. And eventually that caused them to actually submit. That and the fact that they actually said that they would allow the local insurgents to storm the actual place, and the French knew that if they did that, they wouldn't, not one of them would come out alive. So it helped to sort of turn the French into admitting that they needed to do this. But we come back to Dubrovnik, because the insurgents with Hildebrand have been continuing this besieging of them and actually starving them out, but the French are not giving up. So Host finally comes back. He then finds that General Lutonovic had actually come in with the Austrian army, and they had come to take it. But incredibly, again, they had turned up without any siege artillery. So how they thought they were going to take it, I have no idea. So they eventually get Host to help. And again, you see her on heights here. And that's where, again, Host manages to get some guns brought up here. This time, he finds an aqueduct from these hills, which runs down towards the city. So just like Lowe had done elsewhere, he actually ran the guns up the actual aqueduct, using it like a nice level bridge so he could get it up to the top quite quickly. And from this point, they were able to fire down into the main squares in the city and cause total consternation within the actual population, who effectively forced Montrechard, the French general, to eventually agree to submit. But there was one final little act that was involved in this, because Hildebrand and Kaboga and all the insurgents were in this area here of the city, and they were told that the gates would open at 7 o'clock the following morning for them to march in to take the city. And lo and behold, at this end, at 9 o'clock the night before, the French opened the gates for the Austrians and Host and his men to come in, so Host could actually claim some part in actually taking the place. And when the gates were opened over here in the morning, the insurgents found the Austrians guarding the gates and basically making it clear to them that if they tried to do anything to the French or ransack the place in any way, they would actually find the Austrians would sort them out. So that's how the siege ended. As you can imagine, Hildebrand, who was with the insurgents for quite a while, was actually quite put out about this. Now, they went along the Adriatic coast going up towards Vienna, and Trieste and Zara were also attacked. By this time, the Austrians are trying to take these, and again, the Navy gives them help in actually taking them. And then eventually they arrive at Venice. But one of the things that perhaps is not known as well is that right at the end of the war, as it's coming to an end, the first thing we have is that Bentinck, who actually commands the troops in Sicily, lands troops around Leghorn, and they go to Genoa. And they actually manage to actually take Genoa just as the war is ending. In fact, Napoleon had actually abdicated before it fell, but they actually managed to take it. But at the same time, an Austrian army under General Nugent had actually started crossing from Venice and clearing the French out of all the sort of northern Italy. And along with him went part of the 35th, who had actually come up all the way up through the Adriatic. And they have the single distinction of actually going through with him. And they actually eventually arrive and join Bentinck at Genoa as the war comes to an end. But as you can see, there's been a lot more cooperation between the two services than has been normal in the past. Corfu we left behind. Corfu, at the last minute, you get a couple of people here that perhaps you will have heard of. General Donzelot actually commands here, and it's Thomas Maitland who actually takes the island. It's actually done as a basically an agreement between the two, because obviously the Brits were in no position to actually take it militarily. But Donzelot actually gives it to them rather than allowing anybody else to get control of the Ionian Islands. So it means that Britain has got the complete Ionian Islands. So it's like a gentleman's agreement that Britain just sort of marches quietly in on the last day of the war. And that's how that gets taken. Now, obviously, things start up again in 1815. And the only thing I'll mention about this is that we had troops over in Genoa, etc., and they had moved up to, and they got moved early in 1815 when things started happening, to Marseille. And we know that Hudson Lowe supposedly, according to the few reports there are, didn't suit Wellington, and he gets sent down here. But there is a site that it's almost seen as it's being a demotion, that he's actually being sent away because he's no good. Now we've seen, and there are other incidents that I mentioned in the book where Lowe has done extremely well in the Mediterranean. And in fact, he's sent to actually take control of these troops at Marseille. And they have been given the particular task of taking all the French ports along the coast. Because at the end of the day, they don't want Napoleon having the ability to start messing around in the Mediterranean again. And in fact, he manages to take some troops, his troops, and gets General Nugent, the Austrian, to come with him to surround the French in Toulon. So we end up right back where we were in 1793 in 1815, with this time Hudson Lowe commanding the heights, and he actually organizes for the actual French to surrender. And the very day that they're going to march into the actual city, and he will obviously have his name in lights in the report saying that he's actually commanded the troops to have taken it, he gets the order to go back to London with immediate effect. But what we now know is his orders to go to St. Helena with Napoleon. So he doesn't get that fame either. But he actually is the one who actually organizes this entire, it wasn't a siege, but as a sort of a blockade, should we say, and was going to get all the credit for doing so. Now that is the talk in a nutshell. Really what I was trying to give you an idea is as the war went on, it became more a thing where both the army and the navy worked together, and actually they did cooperate fully. And in fact, often the army were leading the move to take more islands rather than the actual navy, etc., because it wasn't of any benefit to them. So it changed things dramatically. And as I say, I have written 2 books on the subject. I only just mention them quickly here now. Obviously, the Forgotten War against Napoleon, I just mentioned it. Not everything in the Mediterranean is forgotten, but there are many bits of that war that have been forgotten, and that's why I called it that. That gives the overview of the thing. And as I've mentioned, John Hildebrand, he became a lieutenant later and fought at Waterloo. Well, he was close to Waterloo because he was at Ath, but he did get involved in some of the sieges later on as well. But that's the talk as such. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing now and I'll hand it over to John.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was an absolute wonderful tour de force, taking us through not only the whole geographic spread of the Mediterranean and the Adriatic, but going up until, 1814 and 1815. So let me, without more ado, hit the chat button and work my way through that, because I know we have quite a lot of questions. So I hope you're ready for these.
Yeah.
Let's just do this. Lots of people saying, thank you, Gareth. Very, very interesting talk. Thank you very much indeed, which is all great. Let me get into some of the questions. Evelyn's asked a question about the hood that is at Toulon, because as you point out, there are 3, but this I think is Lord Hood, isn't it?
Yes.
The older one of the 3. Yeah.
Yeah. His son was there as well, Captain Hood, wasn't he?
Right. We've got a question from Andrew Dismore, and this is about Toulon again, but would the French royalists have allowed the removal of their fleet to Gibraltar? And he's comparing that with Iran in World War II. And is the Abel Gone silent film about Napoleon accurate? Read Toulon. I can't help you on the Abel Gance film, I'm afraid.
No, it's a while since I've seen that. Well, the first thing is I get what you're saying about the what would the French have thought about the British taking it away. But realistically, for the start off, the French Navy that had been in there, the actual crews were obviously clearly a huge problem. So one of the things that the actual he did initially was to actually allow 4 line of battleships to leave with all the French crews on it, so they were no longer ashore in Toulon, causing a huge problem. Yeah, because these were largely pro-Republicans as well, so they wanted them out of the place. So 4 ships had left already. It's really inconceivable. There were no real local forces there in any position to actually do anything. And yes, they may not have liked them doing it, but at the end of the day, if those ships had been removed at that stage, it would have completely decimated the Toulon fleet for the next decade. Whereas instead, I mean, I didn't go into all of this in talks. I can't. There's just so much to talk about. But in 1796, at the end of 1796, the British Royal Navy abandoned the Mediterranean completely. There wasn't one ship east of Gibraltar at the end of the year. And in fact, that didn't change until about 4 months later, when Nelson took a few ships in and found out and was back off Toulon for a short while himself. But it literally got to that point. It would never have got to that point if the French fleet in Toulon virtually hadn't existed.
That's great. I have a lot of questions coming in about the Adriatic. So
Yes.
One question from Clive Hammersley: was there an Ottoman fleet? And if so, was it used to defend its territory in Greece and Egypt? So I guess the question is, was the Royal Navy, why was the Royal Navy able to have it all its own way?
Well, the Ottoman Empire at that stage effectively ended with Greece. Yeah, in that part of the world, they weren't interested further west than that. Other than that, it was inland countries they had, not coastal lands. So they were, obviously, the Ottoman Empire was friendly with Britain, although I have to say, just a few years before, in 1807, there had certainly been issues between the Russian fleet and the Ottoman fleet. There had been battles in fleet. I mean, in my Mediterranean book, I actually cover all these other aspects as well, because of course you can't just deal with the British bit. There is the whole point of, there is an Ottoman fleet, yes, and it's not the best of fleets, but it is a sizable fleet. And in fact, they actually end up getting quite badly damaged by the Russian fleet at different times. But certainly the Brits never have an occasion where they really get involved with that fleet, because even when they make their attack on Constantinople, etc., the Turkish fleet doesn't really put up a major fight against them. They actually allow the sort of land batteries, etc., to do all the work, should we say.
Great stuff. Andrew Dismore points out the interesting thing about the Battle of Lissa is that it was Trafalgar in reverse. The British fleet formed a line and the French tried to break it, but unlike Nelson, they were not able to do so. How very true. Yes. Question from Rohan. He asks, what did the army want with the small Croatian islands?
Well, it's a good point in a sense. I mean, I think their main task was to take the territories, because they didn't like having enemy forces nearby, because conceivably a garrison of 100 on the next island can get a boat and attack you. So the first thing you're thinking about is your own defense, of like, let's take all the islands, then they can't be a problem to us. So there's that point. I guess it's also a territorial thing, but I think the main thing is to eradicate any possibility of awkwardness with some of their units fighting back, should we say.
I understand. Roger cleverly has sent in a couple of comments here. There is a mention of splints used to fish masts being used to run artillery ashore in Armoury's training. This was used as an MTB base in World War II, interrupting Axis sea communications in exactly the same way. So I guess that's what's in it for them. And he also says, my understanding is that Host got two 18-pounders up onto the other side of the sea lock using a kedge anchor as a purchase.
Well, he used all sorts of stuff. I mean, it was a lot of rope and tackle and all sorts, because I mean, at the end of the day, it took a huge amount of work. In fact, he got more than 2 guns up. He took a couple of mortars and all sorts up eventually. If you're talking of Cator or Cator, yeah, he managed to get quite a few up. When you actually read of what they had to do to get the guns up there, it is incredible, to be honest. Absolutely incredible.
Right. Evelyn turns around and says, nice to hear something positive about Hudson Lowe. Wellington wasn't so positive.
No, absolutely. I have to say, with regard to Wellington, I mean, we have the one recorded incident of where he effectively calls him a fool. But, you know, the source for that is actually very vague. And it's the only source. So it's, you know, yes, we know later on that, you know, there was some thoughts about the fact that how he handled things at St. Helena were not done well, and Wellington partly got involved in that. But even he admitted that nobody could have done well in that situation, because Napoleon was an arch expert at making everything look the way he wanted it to look, and he wanted it to look as if the Brits were treating it extremely badly, and whoever had been in charge there was on hiding to nothing. Yeah, but as I said, if you actually read all of the things about Hudson Lowe, and that includes Capri. Capri is actually used as a factor. Oh, he lost Capri. He was defeated there. If you actually look at the incident at Capri, he didn't have an awful lot of a chance. He was overwhelmed by numbers, and the other regiment that was supposed to have actually fought with him actually fought extremely badly. And at the end of the day, he was overrun without any chance of really turning that around. So, and then you look at all these other incidents he's involved in, and he is being very proactive. He's being very upfront. He's very positive about, you know, sort of getting involved in what are potentially quite difficult situations, but he just goes for it, and he's not waiting for orders to do it either. You know, as I said, on that one incident going down the aqueduct, no orders. In fact, his orders were positive. He not to do that. You know, it was a case of he just thought this will solve the problem. But in a sense, it's almost, he is actually also, in the sense there, showing the same attitude as every other British infantry officer seems to show in the Adriatic. They're not under the shackles of Wellington. They're being allowed to think about, right, I think I can take that island. And they're just being allowed to do it. And basically, as long as they succeed, they're okay. You know, and they seem to just, and that culture seems to grow throughout the whole period.
Great, thank you. I'm working down more. Clive Hammersley, very enjoyable. Thank you. Ian Hughes, excellent presentation, Gareth. Thank you. John Thornley, bravo, Gareth, a real tour de force. Brian Southwell, good talk, Gareth. Ian Dethridge, many thanks, Gareth. Paul Chamberlain, fascinating talk. Josephine Oxley, thank you, Gareth. Great talk and wonderful images. Ian Chard, superb. Thank you for some fascinating insights into inter-service cooperation. John Gretzer, thank you, Gareth. Very interesting. Colin Jones, thanks, Gareth. Very interesting talk. Howard Lorryman, to everyone, thank you very much indeed. Peter Cross, excellent, well done, very interesting. The Forgotten War Against Napoleon is an excellent read. So there's a plug for the book. John Haynes, now I know why there is a Fort Wellington and a Fort George on Viz. I walked up to the former when we stopped there on a cruise around the islands.
Yep.
And I think that's one that Ian Young wrote a piece on in the Waterloo Association.
Yes, I'm sure he did, yes.
Red Ponsonby, thanks a lot. Stephen Debbie, very interesting talk. Thank you, Gareth. Evelyn, thank you, Gareth. Well done. I've been to Viz and inspected the fort. Paul Chamberlain, the naval transport at Abaca contained elements of dockyard personnel, coopers, shipwrights, blacksmiths, etc., who repaired carts, water casks, etc., for the troops on shore and made wheelbarrows for use by the army. Michael, I think I've lost a comment there. Vic Powell, thanks, Gareth. Informative and interesting as always. Pat, many thanks, Gareth, for a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. From Michael, this is it. There's also a host island off Viz. Clive Hammersley, I believe that the Corsair states, which was nominally Ottomans, had warships and were quite friendly, respectful of the British fleet, even supplying stores. Well, a lot of meat supplies, of course, there. Andrew, we kept the Tunisia well into the 19th century, 1862. Thank you, Gareth, for a really fascinating talk from Julia Grundy, Adrian Clark. Thank you, Gareth, for a very interesting and informative talk. Do you have any plans to give your talk at the Army Museum on the 52nd at Waterloo, which was postponed in the spring?
Yes, it's going to be an online talk. I can tell you it's already been booked by the Army for me. Although obviously as members of the WA, they can see it isn't going to be on our website as well anyway for the last time I did it. John?
Yes, well, we will definitely put that on the website.
I'll get the. So I've got just get my phone back on because I've had it off so it doesn't ring in while I was talking. But I have a date in. It's definitely in March that I'm actually doing it for the National Army Museum, and it'll be an online talk. So they'll be advertising. In fact, I think they said they were advertising it from today.
Fantastic. Well, while you're doing that, Peter Cross has made the observation that I hope that's Australian wine that Gareth is drinking.
No, it's Belgian beer.
Ah, fantastic. And Neil Carey shares a view that I think will be endorsed with everybody. Excellent. My family will be delighted that there are yet more Napoleonic battlefields to explore, even while we're on Mediterranean holidays.
Oh, I can only say I would love to do a tour around that part of the world. What an excuse to do the Adriatic Islands.
Oh, magical, magical. Howard Lorriman will ring Ken Topman and Calibre tomorrow. My book sorted for Christmas. Look forward to next Waterloo Archive. Do you want to do a quick plug on your Waterloo Archive now that Ken Topman's publishing it?
Can do, yeah. Well, as everyone knows, I mean, obviously I did the first 6 with Pen and Sword. And sorry, if somebody was saying they're going to go to Ken Trotman for these books, these 2 I've just advertised are actually on their Pen and Sword. They're available in normal circumstances. But obviously most companies won't do after 6. I mean, they say that's enough volumes. But I have been finding so much more material that I just keep going. And we've already published volume 12 about a month and a half, 2 months ago now, on British stuff. I've already got volumes 13 and 14 ready to go to him next month, which will come out in the spring sometime. I think Stephen's on this call, so he'll probably be thinking, oh my goodness, another 2 to do. But they'll be coming through to him in January. But I'm probably coming towards the end of the British stuff. I've been very much trying to work with people regarding getting some French archives on there and some further Dutch stuff. If that comes off, there'll be more volumes, but the British stuff I'm probably getting towards the end of it, if I'm honest. Maybe a 15th will probably be the last, if that.
Well, you've already got a comment from Stephen Summerfield. What fun. So no doubt he's looking forward to that immensely. And Brian Southwell has said, I've got 7 to 12 for my surprise Christmas present to myself. Roll on the 25th and I can make a start. Excellent, excellent.
Sorry, I didn't mention that, yeah, they're only available from Ken Trotman Publishing, though. So you have to go to Ken Trotman Publishing. I know there is a book, Stephen will probably say there's a bookstore you can get it from, but I don't even know where that bookstore is, and it must be local to him somewhere. But basically, you have to go through Ken Trotman Publishing, which you can get through online.
Great stuff, great stuff. Well, listen, again, many, many thanks indeed. That was absolutely wonderful. Folks, let me give you just some parish notices. We have a break for the Christmas festivities, and I look forward very much to seeing you back here on the 6th of January when Nick Lipscomb will be talking all things about the Congress of Vienna. After we go through the 6th of January, I will then be releasing on Eventbrite the next 3 talks, and These will be again real treats. So these will happen in February, the 10th, the 17th, and the 24th of February. On the 10th, we will have Mike Robinson talking about the 69th Regiment at Waterloo. On the 17th, we will have Josephine Oxley talking about Wellington and women of influence. And on the 24th of February, we will have Julian Spilsbury talking about his original research on Henry Harding. After the 24th of February, there'll be a gap of 1 week, and we will then have another 3 talks on the 3rd, the 10th, and the 17th of March. 3rd of March, Paul Chamberlain on why the hulks were so terrible or perceived as being so for prisoners of war. 10th of March, Andrew Field. We're waiting to see what the subject will be there. And we will round off this series on the 17th of March with Carol Duval talking about Egypt, the 1801 campaign. We're very close now to putting the recorded talk so far onto the members zone. Owen has done a wonderful job top and tailing my one on Trafalgar, so that will go up shortly. So will the 2 talks that we recorded at Ian Binney's Warwick event, and Gareth's talk will go on as well. So just bear with us while we do that. We're obviously very grateful to Owen and also to Alan Young for facilitating putting those recordings up there. I think that all it leaves me to do is thank you all for coming, and thank you so much for all your comments, particularly thanks to Gareth for doing such a splendid talk this evening, and to wish you and everybody all the very best for Christmas and hopefully a much better 2021. Thank you again.